Hi, this is Paul. I mentioned this video briefly in a video, I think it was last week, but it deserves a lot more attention. Chad sent me a text this morning with some stuff that he woke up thinking about, and it reminded me of this video, and it reminded me that probably I should give this video more attention. Ross Douthat has been writing, I think, really perceptive stuff that connects with a lot of the conversations that we've been having. You know, he's primarily in a print world, obviously writes for an opinion columnist for the New York Times, Roman Catholic, but his story is very TLC. And he's got a book coming out. It's not out yet. Believe Why Everyone Should Be Religious. And I've read a number of his previous books about religion and what's happening with religion in America, and I think he's basically right. I think he's basically right. And so I'm sure I'll read this book too, and I'm sure I'll enjoy it. This conversation with Sean McDowell, I thought there's so much really helpful stuff in it. So I'll play some of it and maybe highlight a few things.
But yeah, I mean, you saw an essay I wrote where the argument was basically that, I don't think it's that the supernatural ever actually goes away. In fact, one of the arguments that I make in the book is that what people talk about as sort of disenchantment in modern life is a little bit of an illusion. People keep on having mystical and supernatural experiences, even under officially secular conditions. But I do think that societies sort of go through waves and shifts, right? And when I was starting out as a journalist in the early 2000s, there was a big moment when atheistic arguments, the new atheists, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, they found a big audience. And there was sort of a receptiveness to critiques of religion for a whole bunch of reasons that we don't have to go into right now, but that sort of primed American society and Western society for attacks on religious belief. And I think we're in a moment now that's quite different. I think we're in a moment where people feel the absence of religion and are sort of nostalgic for belief. I think a lot of people feel like, the promises of secularism and materialism haven't been fulfilled, that people sort of feel adrift in the world. I think the internet in particular has made people feel sort of more isolated and adrift. And so there's both, I think, a renewed sort of sense of people sort of experimenting spiritually, sort of casting around for, whether it's astrology or psychedelics or the renewed fascination with UFOs. I think all of these reflect this sort of impulse to reach up and out that's stronger now maybe than 15 years ago. And then the book itself, I think, though, is I'm sort of pitching the book to everyone. Of course, everyone should buy this book, but especially towards a kind of person who is attracted to religion, is interested in spiritual ideas, but thinks of that attraction as kind of an abandonment of their reason. The sense of like, well, it would be nice if religion was true, but in order to believe that.
Now, obviously, there's a lot of people in this corner that feel that way, but I'm not so sure. And I think that's probably a good way to view the potential audience in terms of his New York Times audience. But I don't know. I think in a lot of ways that page has turned, and the Wesley Huff, Joe Rogan moment, I think has sort of highlighted the fact that vibe is probably a lot more powerful than, let's say, the hard apologetics, even though the Wesley Huff, Billy Carson thing was all about hard apologetics. One of the videos that I was thinking about today, in the last few videos, I've talked about the epistemic revolution and the death of facts. And I don't think the death of facts means what it sounds like. And I think the whole Wesley Huff moment illustrates how there's sort of a kayfabe going on where we just sort of imagine that the person with the facts wins the argument. And that's not true. It also doesn't mean the facts don't matter. It just means that, again, I think McGilchrist has this right, that the facts are a part of the story, but they're only a part of the story. And in many ways, they're a secondary part of the story. Vervaeke talks about propositional tyranny. And whereas Billy Carson sort of gets embarrassed and destroyed because he just has a whole lot of basic facts wrong, then when I watch the victory laps and the obsession over that moment, I think, yeah, but it's not the whole story. Partly just given the fact that, of course, Mel Gibson follows on Rogan, and Gibson's just a crazy ride, okay? Gibson is just a crazy ride. Always has been, even before, back in his old drunk days, always been a crazy ride. If you're old enough to remember the Lethal Weapon movies and Mel Gibson out in the desert with the Gibson just a crazy ride. But let's continue.
That I have to give up on what science and rationality tell us. And I don't think science and rationality get you all the way to our shared Christian commitments, but I think they get you somewhere to a basic religious posture, a basic sense that some kind of God probably exists. The universe is probably made with human beings in mind. And I'm trying to get people that far in this book.
Now I haven't obviously read the book yet, so don't quite know what approach he's going to take, but I don't know if the metaphor of sort of getting you a certain ways is the right one. I think it's much more like, after you've gotten a certain way, this can sort of help you feel better about it. I've been reflecting on super low resolution biases because I really have to pick up the implicit religious matrix series that I started a couple weeks ago, because I so often notice that whether it's sort of the Christian, non-Christian, or it's the political Republican, Democrat, or it's the movement conservative versus progressive liberationist, people sort of keep a catalog of check marks on people: good guy, bad guy, good guy, bad guy. And depending on where they sort of lie with this check mark, that automatically predisposes a bias for almost everything they listen to. And I have this in me too, even though I'm sort of a mess in terms of many of those polarities. But of course, I have all my own biases. And this, I think, gets to Vervaeke's relevance realization that, part of what I'm trying to do is work really hard at, on one hand, appreciating just the super low resolution disposition setting that we have in us, but not let that hinder me. Because so often, those who, let's say, might be in the bad guy category or don't trust category, that's probably a better way to say it, don't trust, don't trust, leave the gate open, make sure the gate is make sure there's a filter on. I learn so much from people on the other side. And so, but you can't just say, okay, I'm going to be open to everything. You can't be open to everything. That's simply not how we work. You can't be all mouth and no body. Your mouth needs to be just a little portion of you that you take in air and you take in food and you take in water. But you need a filter. And so that implicit binary trust-distrust filter is important. But you've really got to manage it so it doesn't filter out too much.
So I've co-written a book with my father. It's an evangelistic book, kind of unapologetically starts with the person of Jesus and makes the case that Jesus is God and somebody should be a Christian. Now, you have a different approach in this book. I'm just curious, what are you aiming to accomplish with Believe? And why did you approach it kind of the way that you did, given our cultural moment?
So yeah, I basically end the book where it sounds like you start. So I end the book with a chapter called A Case Study, Why I Am a Christian, where I basically talk about Jesus, I talk about my own religious journey, I talk about the Gospels, I talk about why the Christian story is compelling and why I think it fits with the argument for being religious that I've made in the prior chapters. But I think we're in a moment right now where, as a culture, we have become sufficiently not just post Christian, but post religious in certain ways, that there's value in a kind of table setting for specific Christian arguments that wouldn't have been the case 100 years ago or 2,000 years ago, right? You know, if you go back to the world where Jesus was preaching, where the disciples were preaching, and so on, you know, not just among the Jews, but among Roman pagans and elsewhere, there was a sort of shared framework that, you know, the cosmos was created and meaningful. There was disagreement about who, you know, whether there was a God, who the gods were, and so on. But, you know, when St. Paul goes and preaches and talks about, you know, the unknown God, right, he's speaking to a pagan world that took religious ideas seriously, that took the supernatural seriously, that had their own religious practices. Our world is different. It's not completely post-religious, as I said. I think there's still lots of, even among people who don't believe in God, there's lots of spiritual energy and activity out there. But there is a sense, I think, especially among, you know, the most educated Americans and Westerners and so on, a sort of, people have kind of forgotten what makes religious arguments important and interesting in the first place, right? Like, why would you have a religious posture towards the universe? Why would you think there might be a God? Why would you consider prayer and these kind of things, right? I think a lot of people have sort of put that reality a little bit behind them while remaining sort of interested in religious possibilities. And so I think there's value in a kind of, in effect, a kind of table setting of saying, okay, you know, and this is sort of similar to arguments that Christian intellectuals have made before in the past, right? That there are certain things about God that we can only know through faith and revelation. But there are also certain things about God that we should be able to figure out through reason. And I'm saying, you know, for a lot of people, it might be useful to start with those things you can figure out through reason before you take the next step into the quest for an actual relationship with God.
I think part of the difficulty we're facing, and this gets sort of into my God number one, God number two thing, is that John Vervaeke keeps saying that he thinks that in the next, say, I don't know how long he's thinking, certain number of years, theology is going to be a critical subject that people get back in. And that's a, you know, what's interesting about that is for 80 years, theology has sort of been sidetracked over towards people who like that sort of thing, and regular people stay away from it, whereby, you know, but that sort of leaves people without guides out there in the world to sort of pick up what they can from movies, all the implicit stuff that's out there. And I think just even the question of what on earth people mean by the word God is something that's deeply important. Sometimes people wonder why I use the clips that I do in my videos and what sort of occurs to me. Well, a lot of it has to do with what sort of sticks. Because obviously I watch a lot of videos and I'm actually mostly listening to a lot of videos. And certain things that certain people say just sort of really stick. And even months or years later, there'll be something that I hear and it's like, yeah, that was really important. And I think it was really true. And so then when I'm processing a video like the McDowell Douthat video, something like this will come to mind.
years and very successfully, but was still, doing this sort of one-to-one readings with individuals. And ultimately, what happened was I was very good at what I did. And so word of mouth spread, and I started seeing all sorts of people. So people would come in from all over the world to have a session with me. And this is when I was really like 20 years old, 19, I was young. And one of those people, or a collection of those people, actually, it's not really just down to one, would be people that that had businesses, and often would be in very senior positions with very big businesses. And of course and I say of course because I was so naive, I was 20, maybe 21 years old. I wasn't, a child and also a bit of an idiot. And I was charging £25 for an hour of my time. And I would be giving them just, so much value. And they saw that. And so basically what happened is that they sort of plucked me out of that and were like, okay, how can we use this? How can we use this? They didn't care. This is the thing that I think I would like everybody to understand about industrial intuition, is that most of the concern and the anxiety about the epistemological validity of psychic work is really held by the middle classes.
Right there. And I think she's exactly right. So I just made a video where Brooklyn Lou is talking about giving up religion and how he feels much freer from that. And of course, we've got T-Grog rolling around here, who's just sort of taking the early 2000s. Let's sort of provoke deconstruction in Christians by mocking them. It just doesn't work. And her point is that it's a kind of a middle class thing to have all of this anxiety about the woo. You go to Mark D. Parker's channel and the House of Woo. They're not anxious about it all. You listen to. I almost made a fuller clip of Mark's little story to add in the vision of the cross that he had. That's on the larger video, and the Buddhist teacher telling him to, not even telling him, sort of telepathically beaming into his brain on the way back from the meeting with the Buddhist guy, the Buddhist teacher that Mark today says is, the most spiritual man he's ever met, to go back and be a Christian. And then Mark processing, back when he had Trump derangement syndrome. You can find this in the TLC harvesting video. We had Trump derangement system. He was going to walk from Redlands to El Paso to protest children in cages, but then his mother gets sick and his wife doesn't want him to go, and so he has to sacrifice this grandiose vision for the basic nuts and bolts middle class taking care of your mom in her elderly years. And Douthat knows this, because Douthat has made the point, this point that she's basically made in much more subtle ways over the years, that Elizabeth Oldfield makes the same point, that it's not that the new atheists just sort of imagine that, oh yeah, everyone's going to be rationalists and give up on religion. That's sort of like the state of California thinking everybody's just going to buy electric cars. And it's like, no, that's not going to just happen, because that's not how people are, and it's not how they work.
Right? It really is. It's like those of us who have a sort of enough understanding of, knowledge and philosophy and natural science to kind of have questions, but not enough of an education or an understanding to actually deeply question why we think we know what we think we know. And most of the people that are making the most money in the world, and I say this with absolute confidence because I know them, they are using any form of extra information that they can. They don't care where and how I get the information. They're not even interested in why or how I know these things. They care about the bottom line. And so when I realized this and discovered this, I've never been, not ever been somebody that has been trying to prove my value, like not ever, and I never will be. I went through a period of time where I felt very concerned, I suppose, and I still have this, am I giving enough? That's a different kind of question. But in terms of like, was it valuable? Like that I wasn't trying to ever prove to somebody that psychic, I'm problematizing this word, but, you know, intuitive information was valuable because it just evidently was. And so I had these clients that then...
And even if you're sort of outsourcing it with a woman like this, or I've been listening to the Elon Musk biography. I forget the title of the author. He also did the one on Jobs. He also did the one on Einstein. But I've been listening to that biography, and I think her point is correct that the real captains of the world aren't, you know, wringing their hands over, you know, the minimal facts argument. It's not where they're at. It's the middle class that are dealing with this.
Well, I love that about your book, especially as an apologist. I'm constantly inviting people to examine the evidence, consider the facts, whether it's a natural revelation or, say, the resurrection of Jesus. And you point towards that.
Again, it's basically a middle class preoccupation.
Towards the end of the book. One of the interesting things you say, Ross, is I give a talk on sometimes college campuses. And the theme is why a spiritual quest should begin with Jesus or should begin with Christianity. And I specifically say a spiritual quest rather than a religious quest, because religion in people's minds feels antiquated. They're aware of the abuse of religion. It doesn't invite a conversation. And yet you make a real interesting point, and I want you to unpack this, is that we shouldn't just defend the spiritual, but we should defend the religious. What do you mean by that, and why do you make that point?
So, yeah, I think you're absolutely right about where a lot of people are right now, and when people hear the word religion, they associate it with both sort of, oppression and crimes in the Western and American past. They associate it with institutions and doctrines, right?
And again, if you flip back to the other video, if you go to the end, what was so interesting to me about this video is not only the level of just outspoken, unapologetic woo, but also the wokeness of it. And what was so interesting is that the wokeness just fit right in. And of course, you could apply, let's say, Tom Holland to this and say the Roman emperors were just as wooey, but this wasn't their frame for figuring it out.
Avoiding being, I don't want to replicate that. I think that's the thing, is that I do not have any interest in replicating structures of oppression and hierarchical, organizations and anything like that. And so the way that we do that is we redistribute power, and we constantly need to be empowering the individual, other people, and through community. So my concern entirely is not with, my goodness, and it's very difficult, and I struggle with it. The amount of responsibility that people want to give to me is overwhelming, and it is a cause of incredible suffering, has been a cause of incredible suffering for me, because I just, like I've said, just want to hang out and paint pictures and cook food and spend time with people that I love and make music and art and be in the sun. And yet I also know that I have a very heavy responsibility when I'm in a particular position of getting access to information and then giving it to people. So the solution, I believe, fundamentally will always be community, access to community and redistribution of power. So any power that I have, like doing this podcast, why am I doing this podcast and not somebody else? Well, for a whole collection of reasons, right, that are deeply connected to my privilege, my access, my visibility, my whiteness, my education.
My tribalism.
Right. But we can't, it's not that that these are bad things necessarily. Some of those are bad things, but most of it's not that it's bad. It's that we have a responsibility when we have access, or we have a platform, or we have.
So it just fascinated me how those two things could just sort of go back and forth.
That don't seem relatable and so on, right? So for a lot of people, it makes sense to present religious ideas as part of a kind of personal spiritual quest. However, it's also the case that when we talk about religion traditionally, we mean a couple of things, right? We mean sort of communal and institutional structures of support for people's spiritual quest, right? Their sort of personal encounter with the divine. And we also mean rules that sort of establish what right belief is supposed to be, but also establish kind of guardrails around experimentation and purely individualized forms of practice. And it's really hard, I think, to have a healthy spiritual life if you never get those aspects of religion into the mix. Now, if you're just starting out, right? And I say this in the book, like, if you're starting out and you're convinced I should be interested in God, right? I should be interested in my purpose in life. Obviously, you're not going to immediately go from there to full conversion to, and I mean, unless divine grace enters in, right? But just on your own, it's not like, all right, I've decided this and now I'm going to join this particular branch of the Presbyterian Church or something. No, it's natural to have a period of exploration. Like, there's a lot of people who have never opened the Bible or any scripture from any world religion, right? There's a lot of people who just haven't had an encounter with basic ideas and stories and arguments. And in that period of encounter, it is going to be kind of an individual thing that you're doing. But you shouldn't imagine that as your goal for your actual spiritual life, right? You could say, okay, I'm going to have this phase of sort of reading widely, maybe, going to different churches, doing sort of personal experiments. But the goal should be to condense that opening into a particular choice. First, because you're going to need support, community, fellowship, people around you who are practicing the same faith as you, people around you strengthening you and building you up in your faith, people around you who encourage you when you hit those spiritual deserts and those dark nights of the soul, right? That's the communal side, and you can't have that without something that we call religion, as loaded as the word may be. And then also, and this is, I think, I think less true of people who are, having their initial spiritual encounter with Jesus, right? With someone trying to introduce them to the Jesus of the New Testament, as you would. But there's a lot of people out there who are just trying to be open to God, divine possibilities, who are doing a lot of different things right now. You go into my local Barnes and Noble, and there's 3 shelves of Christianity and Judaica, and 3 shelves of spiritual self-help, kind of Oprah Winfrey stuff, and 3 shelves of magic, tarot, astrology, witchcraft, right? So I mean, that's a big thing, and there's I know a lot of people in my supposedly secular profession of journalism who will say, oh, I had I went on a ayahuasca retreat, right? I did, I did this thing with a shaman. It was super weird, right? So there's just a lot of stuff that people are getting up to and experimenting with. And one of the arguments in my book for those people is that if you take spiritual reality seriously, if you think in some form the supernatural exists, then, like any territory, in the real world, it's going to have dangers. It's going to have, inhabitants who might not be perfectly friendly to human beings, who might not necessarily have our good in mind. Again, you don't have to go all the way to specifically Christian conceptions of the demonic and, the possibility of having your soul possessed or lost and so on. I think to persuade people that you want to have some guidance, some rules, some recommendations for what to do. And again, I think that gets you back pretty quickly to something that you have to call religion. Like you do need the accumulated wisdom of people who have, gone on spiritual quests before. And what carries that, what transmits it? It's religious traditions. It's not just the individual.
Also, one of my favorite points of your book is at the end, you ask the question.
I don't want to play the whole thing. The link to it is below. It's a really outstanding conversation, and I love the point that Douthat makes in terms of the points that he just made as people think about where can I go, what can I do, and again, I think Douthat is right in terms of there's a lot of people I talk to who say, even you listen to Alex O'Connor. I've tried becoming religious. I want to become religious. I just haven't been able to make it over the hump. And so, in all honesty, I'm still an agnostic, yada, yada, yada. Hey, fair enough. I'm glad he's honest with himself and honest with us. That's a really helpful thing. And, faith is a gift. I really believe that. I mean, I'm a Calvinist. I know some people don't think so, but I am. And faith is a gift. And I think the best thing that you can do if you want it is to ask God for it. I mean, ask and it will be given. Seek and you'll find. Knock and the door will be open. It's a gift. And sometimes you have to wait a long time for a gift. Sometimes the time isn't right. And I've made the point a number of times that God gives the gifts when he wants to, not when we think he should, not when we want it, and the illustration I often use is Paul of Tarsus. So towards the beginning of the book of Acts, we sort of first meet Paul at the stoning of Stephen, and Stephen looks up and the heavens open and he's talking to God, and Paul's sitting there, blessing the whole enterprise of stoning. And you might say, well, how hard would it have been, Lord? While you got the doors open, while Stephen's looking up, while all that's happening, maybe if you'd look and pay a little attention to the guy with the cloaks, then maybe all of those people that he didn't hunt down and brutalize and torture, kill, whatever he did between that point and the road to Damascus, maybe it would have gone nicer for them. And they're your people anyway, right? He's persecuting the followers of the way. That's the whole point. But God's like, nope, I'm going to let him make a big mess until I show up on the road to Damascus, and then he's going to have another 14 years sorting things out, and then, Barnabas bumps into what on earth is happening there in Antioch. It's like they got a little bit of a word of Jesus, and they're sort of worshiping him, but they're all Gentiles, and probably Barnabas is thinking they don't really know what they're doing. And they hear about this in Jerusalem, and they say, well, send Barnabas. And Barnabas said, the perfect guy to help me with this is Paul of Tarsus. And so together we're going to go to Antioch. And of course, they go to Antioch, and they're there for a while. And then the Spirit communicates to the prophets in the church of Antioch to send Paul and Barnabas out to other Gentile places. And it's like, gifts are gifts. Ask, beg, plead. Luke 18, be like the persistent widow. And you might not get exactly what you're looking for, but you get what you need, as the old song says. So anyway, that's probably enough for this video. This conversation between Sean McDowell and Ross Douthat was absolutely excellent. And I'm really looking forward to Douthat's book coming out. And yeah, he's a great writer. He's a really sharp guy. We'll see what happens with that. So leave a comment. Let me know what you think.